So it's awful easy to commit someone and awful difficult to get records
and it often happened, unfortunately, more to women than to men, that in the spousal relationship, the man would go to court and seek that commission. And we can speculate as to why in some marriages that might seem a good way to get rid of your wife, short of murder.
Well, or any problem, brother, sister, husband, wife, grandparents.
And there were some safeguards from their point of view. And I should say that the first duty of somebody who's doing historical research is not to look at that law that Marty just read out loud through the eyes of someone living in 2013.
Right.
You've got to look at it through the eyes of people living in 1940.
Right.
It doesn't make it right, it doesn't make it the preference, but you really need to give them the benefit of the doubt until you discover an abuse, etc. And the safeguards in place were is the person who was alleged, and the word alleged was used in the criminal language, to be insane, the word was in the law. That person was examined by two physicians, and the two physicians had to agree that they would benefit from receiving treatment in the hospital. I don't think that's a great safeguard, but it was seen at the time as a safeguard. And of course the judge would then, the Michigan Court of Appeals routinely faulted the judges for accepting the two physicians' testimony as enough.
Automatically, sort of.
Yeah. So there was actually one case I found, it did not involve my aunt. The Court of Appeals ruled in the case, the entire testimony was this. I can't really remember exactly, but it went something like this. What's wrong with the patient? She's insane. That was the testimony. And the Court of Appeals said, no, that's not good enough. And the probate court, in my opinion, kept getting slapped on the wrist and wasn't paying attention because they kept, it wasn't always, maybe it wasn't that brief after that, but it still wasn't following the law at the time. Not just the law as we would like it to be. They weren't even doing the insufficiency of the law at the time, they weren't even following that.
Well, that law affects so many people, because when you would go and look for records, you would hear over and over again, you and 5,000 other people, you and 10,000 other people, I'm sorry, I can't help you. So there are many other people out there looking for records of their loved ones who had been in some kind of an institution.
The reference you're making is to some specific person who, pulling that 5,000 figure out of the air, said, I got a lot of calls from relatives who have just learned about a family member who they're told was in a Michigan institution, and that situation was duplicated in every state in the country. In fact, not far from, half a mile from Eloise was the cemetery where they buried people, and they used numbered markers because it's too expensive to put names on it, and every state had a cemetery like that, often anonymously buried, because they were not the family members. The only people who would pay to put a marker down would be a family member.
Right.
So yeah, there are a lot of people with lost relatives, and I hear from them. I get a lot of emails. My daughter has teased me and said, Dad, you should go into business now. Not just do this for free. But I feel like this is something, I don't want to use the cliche giving back, but this is a way for me to help people in a very, it's very easy to write an email and send it and say, I would try this, or have you thought about that? And I give them the advice of going to their local genealogy society. Those people love to help you. And sometimes you have to pay a little bit, but that could be a way to go too.
Well, and you spend a portion of the book in detailing the history of those laws and what's happening today. And I'm wondering, do you see that as just because we've always done it that way? I mean, is that kind of the answer that you would get? The reason that those records aren't available, we've just always done it that way?
No, I don't think so. I think it's more, mental health is not a popular legislative issue. If you think about, there are lots of advocates for people who have a mental illness, and there are lots of good legislators. But when does a legislature act about a mental health issue? The answer is when a man with a mental health issue goes into a Newtown school in Connecticut and shoots up the classroom. When a man goes to a shopping mall in Arizona and paralyzes and injures, kills people and paralyzes a congresswoman. When somebody goes into a Colorado movie theater, that's when legislators are demanded, do something about this. It's not a popular issue other times. So I think that there's been a lot of thought that's gone into, there have been 3 revolutions in mental health treatment in America. The first was a medical revolution, because when drugs came into existence in 1955 that you could use to treat people at home and not in an institutional setting, do you think the governors wanted to have large asylums?
No.
That's ridiculous. It's expensive.
Right.
They just didn't know what else to do.
And they kept growing and growing and growing.
It was unsustainable. You could not possibly sustain it. So it was a good thing that medication came along. Now, of course, that medication could and was abused in some places. We all have had that Hollywood image of the drugged out, one flew over the cuckoo's nest, which is unfortunate because while that's true, it's not the entire story. And then there was a legal revolution, preceded, though, by a philosophical revolution. I mean, there was a man who said, there is no such thing as mental illness. We're all on a spectrum. I'm not sure that that's a terribly healthy way to look at mental health either. But then the legal revolution through associations like the ACLU and others felt that there were people who were being kept in mental hospitals who didn't belong there. And lawsuits occurred. One of them occurred in the state of Michigan in 1974. And a 3-judge panel essentially ruled, that the mental health system was unconstitutional. Now, they couldn't close it down because there were real people living in those hospitals. But over the next 8 or 9 years, the institutionalization, which was happening everywhere, began to happen. But, to look back on 1940, and I'm glad you read that passage out loud, but if anybody here is feeling smug about how we're doing better than then, just remember that 50 years from now, someone will be sitting in this room judging how we today are not doing such a great job in mental health, because that's how it always works. We make progress by looking at the mistakes of the past. And the mistake I think that we're making now is that we've recriminalized mental health. We have people in jails who have been judged to have a mental illness after they've been arrested for a crime, and they're segregated from the rest of the population. That's a shame. We have people who are homeless with an untreated mental health issue. Now, what do I feel? And I don't matter in this conversation, I'm just a writer, but I do believe that if you're going to choose between a system that puts people into institutions and a least restrictive environment, which is the 2 spectrums, I definitely favor least restrictive environment. Nobody should be forced to have treatment if they're not a danger to themselves and to others, which is now the standard. Nonetheless, there are people whose judgment is impaired, and they're choosing to live in a homeless situation, and they would be better off if there were services available to them. And we know this as a society, and we're trying to cope with it, but we're not doing a very good job.
And I think we tend to go like this. And where I live in Traverse City is a perfect example. We had a very large institution that with as many as 6,000 patients, and it's now specialty shops and a gourmet restaurant. It's been completely redone. So that's just a real physical reminder of that change.
Right.
So if there are people in the audience who are interested in researching their own family history and writing about it, neither you nor I are genealogists. We talked only tree-dom of research. We're more interested in stories. How does one go about taking the facts, the figures, the dates, the cities, the births, the deaths, and making story from that?
Well, not everybody has to be a storyteller, of course. We're burdened with that, with that curse. And so I wouldn't obviously say to someone, well, you ought to write that if they have no interest in writing it. But if they do have an interest in writing it, I mean, you know how hard it is. I mean, Marty's got me beat. She's got 3 books. She's really an author. I say you can't be an author until you've written 2 books.
Yes, but I hear you're halfway through number 2.
But I think that it's not a family story. It's somebody else's family. You know, so how do you become a writer? It's a mystery. I mean, you and I have read lots of stories about other people's writing habits, and I'm sure you're shaking your head and saying, well, that wouldn't work for me.
Right.
I love the writer who says, and I read this one, so I get up every morning at 6:30 and I have to write 1,200 words by noon, and then I have a yoga class, and then I go for a walk, and then I come back and I write, 300 or 400 more words. And I think to myself, oh great, a recipe for failure every day. So what I did was, I'm very mathematical about this, or practical. I knew when the manuscript was due. I divided the number of months by the number of chapters, and I had to write a chapter every 2.5 weeks. And I thought that was a great victory, because then I could only fail once every 2.5 weeks. But I think
like the way you think.
Would writing groups work? I've talked to people who think that they're the best thing ever, because you get support from other people. And I think support is so important. How do you turn facts into a story? We haven't got time to talk about that. But I do think that there is, writing isn't that mysterious, but it may not be enjoyable. And why would you do something that isn't enjoyable?
Right. Or sometimes enjoyable.
Sometimes
it's just brutal.
Yeah. Well, tell us about it being brutal.
He's turning into journalist mode. Can't you just see it right before your eyes?
It's a 50-minute hour. How do you feel? How do you feel about writing, Marty? You feel sometimes beat up by it and abused?
It's a love-hate relationship, Steve.
Oh, I see.
It's a love-hate.
So would you like to talk about that?
For another time.
Oh, okay.
For another time. But
You're
the
not
simple
paying
answer is how to be a writer is writers write. I mean, that's really the simple answer.
Read.
And writers read. And I think that you were talking about the way that you deliver that secret in the first page. That's where the emotion was. That's where the memories were. That's where the energy was. And so for people who are trying to write about their own lives or their family's lives, I think that's what you do. You go with that.
There was Raymond Chandler, the mystery writer, once was asked, how do you begin a story? And he said, well, you could do worse than a man with a gun coming through the door. So in your book, you start with being broke.
Right.
I mean, well,
Right.
Why did you do that?
Yeah.
Seriously, tell us as a writer, let's turn the tables for just a minute, and you tell us about deciding to start there.
That was sort of the overarching theme of the book, so I thought it was a good place to start. And also that was the most distinct and clear memory I had of that year. The other memories returned when I sat down to write, but that one just returned of its own accord.
It was a moment when your kids were with your husband,
Right.
who she smartly calls Mr. Wonderful. Let's talk about Mr. Wonderful. How does he like this book?
He is so good at going into journalist mode. Now, see, this is my cue that I have to ask you my final couple questions.
So that's the way you're going to get out of it.
Yes, and maybe at some point in the future we could switch chairs here.
Okay, I'd love that.
But I wanted to ask you, first of all, how you feel about your mother today. And if you could ask her one question, what would you ask her?
Oh, gosh. I'm going to answer that one second. I had to think while I'm talking. No one's ever asked me that question. This is why you're a good journalist. I'm going to surprise you I hope, by telling you that I feel closer to my mother today than when she died. I don't think of this as a book of judgment. I think of it as a book of explanation. That was my goal. I wanted to understand my mom, understand why she had told this lie and papered it with other lies. But I feel closer to her because, think about how we regard our parents. Until you're about 10, your parents never had a prior life. They were just your parents. And sometime, hazily around the age of 15 or 16, when you're just starting to do things that you shouldn't, you think of, well, wait a minute, what did mom and dad do? Did they do drugs? Did they, smash the car up? Suddenly it occurs to you that they might have had a life before you were born. But you never really know that life, and you're not terribly interested in it either. So here I am at the age of 55, 56, and I'm spending all this time with my mom at the age of 23, before she had kids, before she's married. Who is she? And I rather liked her. I enjoyed spending time with her at that age. I was frustrated with her. Like, Mom, you wrote 600 letters you and Dad exchanged 600 letters during the war, and you never mentioned Annie once? Like, what's that about? But other, I enjoyed the experience. And so when she died, I wasn't thinking about The Secret. I didn't know really about The Secret very much. But I did know that she was unhappy and burdened and, in my opinion, guilt-ridden. Not a lot of fun to be around some of the time. And so it was much more fun to recapture that youthful, vibrant woman who's standing on, in that photograph on the Chage Lounge.
Yeah.
I love this photograph and spent some pages describing it.
Yes.
And
she looks very happy.
Yeah, and she knows what she's doing. She's vamping it up a little bit, I know it's hard to see up there, but we could have displayed it. The second question, what's the one question that I would ask my mom? Well, as a good journalist, I wouldn't have one question. I'd have a dozen questions. I would not ask her the following question. Mom, would you want me to write this book? I wouldn't ask her that because she would say, are you kidding me?
Stephen.
But if she were alive, of course, it would have been her story. So what would be the question I would have asked her if I was trying to break the ice, if I decided I am going to ask this question? I am going to finally try to unearth Annie. And I guess that I would have said, Mom, you've always told me to tell the truth. And I don't think you're telling me the truth. And why is that? I think that's what I would have asked you, if I would have been smart enough to ask her. And I don't think I would have been smart enough.
Thank you.
For questions from the audience. You'll notice that there are 2 microphones here, or you could just stand and project as they talk to you through the school. So I'm going to be the one to wrangle some questions. Who has a question from the audience for either of our authors here this evening?
Please ask Marty some questions.
Right here in the middle. And please
ask her how can she. I just want to make clear, I'm a Ravens fan and she's a Lions fan. And when I got to her book and she said she was a Lions fan, I thought, I can't read this book.
My name's David. I haven't read the book. Is Annie still alive?
Unfortunately, she's not. She died in 1972 when I was 20 years old and she was 53. And I was home that summer working at one of those summer jobs that we can't get anymore. Where they pay you, actually. And I racked my brain to think of some clue, because my mom took responsibility for burying Annie. I know that from the burial record. Did I miss something? How could I be so clueless? Although most 20-year-olds are clueless. But I did have an excuse. I was flirting with the girl on the bus every day to work, and I think that's where my head was at.
Other questions?
Could you talk about comic books as the nidus for a journalistic career?
Every audience has a ringer. and this is my best friend from childhood. This is Jeff Randolph and his wife, Kathleen, who drove up from Fort Wayne after, it's a long story, after hearing about this night. And so I'm so pleased that he's here. Thanks for coming. Jeff and I shared a lot of things, basketball, comic books. The only thing I didn't share was his talent for music. He was a guitarist that I was in awe of him as a kid because I had no musical talent and still don't. So was comic books an inspiration? I guess any form of writing is an inspiration, and storytelling, comic books are stories. They tell you, they keep your interest. So I probably structured this like a comic book.
I think the phrase is graphic novel.
That's right.
Other questions?
High art form.
Way up in the back there in the pink.
Yes, I'm the president of the local affiliate of the National Alliance on Mental Illness, County Lansing, and we teach courses called Family to Family. And one of the things that happens in those courses is people will go around telling their story and how the burden of those individuals who have come to the class, that their own family members won't have anything to do with their ill member of the family or friend or whatever. And I guess I just, it's more of a comment to say that I think that that stigma and that desire to, or not even a desire, but that tendency to keep that piece a secret exists today. And I guess I don't, you know, it's the universal question, why does that still exist? And it has a lot to do with how we treat mental illness. And
I think it does. And, you know, NAMI, for those of you who don't know about the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI didn't exist before 1979. It came into existence in large part because of the deinstitutionalization movement, and suddenly families were being asked to care. Now, many families cared for people with a mental illness in the 1940s. My family wasn't one of them, although you could argue that my grandmother and my grandfather had cared for Annie for 2 or 3 years until it became too much for them. And I do think it became too much for them. But NAMI grew up because there were lots of families that suddenly had these burdens, and they needed help. They needed to have some support. And I think that, you know, the difference again, though, is it a secret if you're sharing it among the people in that family-to-family setting? Well, no, it's not a secret. You're not burdened by it. Why don't you tell the public about it, meaning people you just meet in your everyday life? Well, maybe it's not helpful to tell people, or maybe you get looked at strangely, or maybe people shy away from you, or maybe it's just tiring. As my wife said when she had breast cancer, I don't want to be regarded as a cancer patient. I'm not defined by my cancer. So she didn't tell people that she had breast cancer, but she wasn't hiding it. I mean, she'll talk about it easily in a group. If it comes up, she'll say, oh, I also had breast cancer. But, you know, I just think that we have to not look at a situation and assume that it's because of a stigma, although there's much stigma that exists. So I think that's one of my answers.
Great. Another question up here, perhaps? Work the room a little bit. There you go,
I had a
ma'am.
question. Right at the beginning of the conversation, you said that some people thought you shouldn't have uncovered the secret or you shouldn't have written about it. Could you?
You mean in my family?
Yeah, could you explain?
You're fascinated by that, yeah.
They talk about family.
Well, I didn't write about it a lot in the book because, frankly, I didn't want to make the book into a descent into my own family dynamics if it wasn't terribly relevant. And it wasn't a big deal. But my older brother, and he has talked about this because I told him I'm going to turn reporters onto you. When they asked me, was there anybody in the family who didn't, is that okay? And he said yes. My older brother is the kind of guy I described in the book as being somebody who moves forward. He doesn't look back. He doesn't want to be held back by the past. He doesn't understand his younger brother's interest in history, and yet he reads a ton of history, which I remind him of from time to time. So he felt that if Mom wasn't alive and I was trying to uncover her reasons for having done this, which I did by talking to friends and other relatives, etc., how could I ever truly get to the bottom of it, truly understand her motives? I would fail. There's no answer to that question. He's right in some literal sense, but I told him, you know, look, Lincoln's not alive anymore, but there are a dozen books about him every year. So that's not the end of the story, and I think we can get to the... So this book is not about my mother's reasons only. It's about the situation, the motivation of other people, about secrets and their damage, about identity.